File systems have been around as long as there has been mass storage. Now, the thing about file systems is that there have been zillions of these different file systems. Most of them are retired, but a number of them are still being used today. Luckily for us, CompTIA enumerates a number of very specific file systems that we need to know about for the exam. So I want to go through these very important, they're very popular file systems, and make sure you're aware of roughly why we use them and what they're for. So let's start with the oldest and the grandest, FAT32. FAT32 is a very old file system. It actually predates Windows in some aspects. It was the first file system that allowed us to do crazy things that we know and love today, like being able to make file names with big long names. Back in the old days, we were limited to these only 8 characters for a file name. Those days are gone, be glad. So FAT32 had some big benefits. Number one, it could support up to 8 TB volumes. So back then we thought that was amazing. And each single file could be as large as 4 GB. So that was even bigger than we could even wrap our heads around. Now, FAT32 is still supported by many operating systems, certainly Windows, but only for very specific situations. For example, if you have a small hard drive, you can still use it for FAT32. Also, FAT32 works on thumb drives. When you're talking about Windows file system, the big kahuna is NTFS, or New Technology File System. Now, NTFS has been around for a long time, but it's being continually improved, and it is absolutely amazing. If you're going to be installing a Windows system today, you will be using NTFS. NTFS, for example, it has massive volumes, up to 16 exabyte volume size, so they're huge. Individual files can be up to 256 TB big, although there might be some limitations depending on how your partition size are that could make it smaller. We don't use a FAT with NTFS, we use something called a master file table. And the master file table sits right in the middle of your volume, so it's in a really strong place and it's impossible to erase, it's very powerful. So if that's all that NTFS had, that would be great, but it has so much more. NTFS supports compression. You can squish down individual files and folders. NTFS supports encryption, where you can on-the-fly transparent encryption. You just save a file, you say, I want to encrypt it, it gets encrypted, you log out, no one else is going to be able to get to it. It also has the de facto standard for individual system and network security used not only with Windows, but every other operating system as well. So NTFS is one of those file systems that not only does Windows use it, but pretty much any other operating system can set up their own NTFS file systems if they want, or at the very least can read other people's NTFS. NTFS is the big thing, and we're going to be seeing lots more of it in this series. Now, the problem with NTFS is that it's so powerful that it has all these extra data structures that make it really big. So if you have a big partition, they're great. But if you have a small, like a thumb drive or something like that, it almost is overkill. So there is a version that's kind of halfway between FAT32 and NTFS called EXFAT. Now, EXFAT supports about the same sizes that we see with NTFS, but what big thing that EXFAT does is it gets rid of all this overhead. So no, you can't really compress with EXFAT, and you don't really have encryption, but a lot of times if I just got a little thumb drive or something, I don't want half of the thumb drive being used just to make my master file table and that type of thing. So EXFAT is, if you're going to be using thumb drives, that's probably the file system you're going to go to, especially if you have a larger thumb drive. The next one is CDFS, and so this is Compact Disc File System. Don't let the CD fool you. It works perfect on Blu-rays and DVDs as well. The CD file system is designed to allow these optical discs, which were originally designed to play movies and music, to organize a file system on that we could read with our operating systems. They are the standard for all optical media, and you can have individual files up to 4 GB big. So those are the big ones. I kind of started with Windows, but I want to move away from that for a minute, and let's talk about Linux. Now, the Linux file system selection is vast. Luckily for us, there's only 2 that are listed on the exam, and these are the 2 big ones, ext3 and ext4. Now, ext3 supports 32 TB volumes, and 2 GB files. It has a few other extra features, but that's the big one, especially when you compare it to ext4, which can support up to 2 exabyte volumes and 16 terabyte files. So I keep saying these huge numbers to you, and I know you're like, oh, Mike, these are massive numbers. Well, you might as well be saying a Googleplex or something like that. Well, remember them, my friends, because I've seen too many file systems where the numbers were small, and then all of a sudden we get into trouble, and then they have to come up with improvements and that type of stuff. All right, now the last one I want to talk about is pretty much exclusively to the Mac OS, and it's called HFS Plus, Hierarchical File System Plus. Now you got to be careful, because if you actually look at the objectives for the exam, you'll see it says HFS, which has been obsolete now for 20 plus years. So we're pretty sure CompTIA means HFS Plus. HFS Plus is the de facto file system that you're going to see when you're setting up hard drives in a Mac OS system, and it supports 8 exabyte volumes and 8 exabyte files. Okay. So we've gone through a number of different file systems here. Number one, and here's the big thing, I want to give you these numbers so that you have some sense of scope as to how big a volume they support or how big of a file they support. The CompTIA exams are probably not going to challenge you on these exact numbers. However, it will expect you to understand why we would use something. If you're setting up a Windows system, you want to know in your head by default you're going to go to NTFS. If you're setting up a Linux system, you know by default you're going to be going to ext3 or ext4. And if you're setting up a Mac OS, you're going to be using HFS Plus. Get the idea?